To jump right into using the analyzer to take a look at T12s and rent rolls. So in this directory, I have real T12s and rent rolls for a property that I've previously analyzed. I've just renamed the property to maintain anonymity. And as you can see in this directory, I have a rent roll and a T12 for that property. And then I made a copy of the analyzer. And I typically create a copy of the analyzer for each property I look at, give it a name that represents the name of the property, and then underscore MFF for Multifamily Financials Analyzer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the rent roll just to give you a sense of the data within that rent roll. And as you can see, it's a pretty standard rent roll with one line per unit. Gives you things like, the square footage per unit, the move-in date, move-out date, lease start, lease end, etc. For that property. Now you'll see some rent rolls that have multiple lines per unit with multiple charge codes per unit, and the analyzer cannot handle those kind of rent rolls. But for now, we'll just take a look at these standard, what I would call standard rent rolls with one line per unit. And then taking a look at the T12, you can see that it's also a pretty standard T12. The first column has all of the charge codes, revenue items, and expense items, and then 12 columns of data for the 12 months represented in the T12, and then a total. The total is not really required by the analyzer, but the 12 months of data is, as well as the charge code. With that, let's jump right into the analyzer, and I'm going to open this up. This is, like I said, just a copy of the analyzer specific to this property. And I would highly recommend creating a copy for each property. That way you always have the master spreadsheet safe elsewhere. Now, the analyzer itself has got the following default sheets. It has got a instruction sheet where it gives you instructions at a high level on how to use the analyzer. It has some buttons that operate across multiple sheets. And then for the T12 and rent roll, it has two sheets each. One is called the T12 raw data, and one is the T12 analysis. And then for the rent roll, you have the rent roll raw data and the rent roll analysis. Now, in general, the raw data is where the raw data from the rent roll or the T12 is inserted, and the analysis is where the actual analysis on the data is performed. And then I have an additional sheet called fetch rent roll T12, and this is used to retrieve the rent roll and T12 from the files themselves. So the files that we looked at earlier, this sheet is used to facilitate the retrieval of the data from those files. So we will start from this sheet. Actually, we'll start with from the starting sheet, and there's a couple of buttons here. You'll notice that all of the sheets are locked. Now, the 5 sheets we looked at do not have password protection on them, so you can unlock them individually. The reason why they're locked is to prevent accidental overwrites of critical data or critical formulas, things like that. But you can always unlock them in case you want to use additional formulas and things like that in that sheet. So you can either unlock them individually, or you can unlock them using these buttons right here. You can protect all sheets and unprotect all sheets. And then the actual analyzer is circulated with sample data. This is to help you understand how the data is used to analyze properties. However, when you look at a new property, you want to start with a clean set of sheets. So there's a button here that allows you to clear all input data across all these 4 sheets. The same button is replicated on the sheets individually so that you can clear one sheet at a time if you need to. But let's go ahead and clear all of the input data in those 4 sheets. So I'll just go ahead and press the button. And I'll ask you confirm the cleaning of the data. Say yes, and it's going to clean those sheets. Now, if you go to those sheets, you'll notice that the data is all gone. It's cleaned out in the rent roll and on the T12 sheets. Okay, so let's start with the T12 first. So we will go to the section relevant to the T12 in the fetch sheet, and it's down here where it says select file containing the T12. So let's go ahead and press that button, and then we'll go to the directory where that file exists, and this is the file we looked at just a minute ago, the T12 file. So I'll click on that and choose, and it'll put the name of the file right here, and then it'll ask for the name of the sheet in that file that contains the data. I know that sheet is already called sheet 1, so make sure that this name reflects the name of the sheet that contains the data in the other sheet. and then the name of a sheet that you want to copy the data into in the current Excel workbook. So I'm going to call it, Hill on Heights T12. So I'm going to call that sheet HOH T12. And then I'm going to set this parameter to no. This parameter determines whether further processing needs to be done on the data. If it's set to yes, using this dropdown, then the additional parameters below come into play. But when it's set to no, these parameters are ignored. So we're just going to set it to no, and it'll just copy the sheet as is into this workbook. Once I've done that, I just hit fetch and clean T12. It's going to run and copy the sheet, as you can see over here. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and copy this data. Just select the relevant area, Control C or Command C if you're on a Mac, switch over to the T12 raw data tab and paste the data that we just copied. And we'll do a paste special and just values. We only want the values. We don't want any other formatting or anything like that. We just want the values to be pasted into this section of the sheet. All right, now that we have all of the data in here, one thing I wanted to point out is that the code works by scanning through this data and stopping when it encounters a blank line. So you wanted to stop here and not stop at these blank lines interspersed in the data. And sometimes you'll see T12s without any blank lines, and sometimes you'll see blank lines. So you just want to go ahead and put some non-blank character into all of those blank cells. That way the code knows to keep looking at the data till it reaches the very end of the data. So we'll just go ahead and non-blank out this blank cells. You can put any value that you want. I'm just going to go ahead and put X's because it's easy and it doesn't have any particular meaning, and we'll just put it there so that the code knows to keep scanning the data until the very end. And there's 3 more here, so we'll go ahead and put X's there. So that way the first blank line that it encounters is at the very end of the data. All right, then once you have the data in and all blank lines eliminated, we then go to the mapping exercise. And the mapping exercise is done on these green cells. And you'll notice that the green cells actually have a drop down that lets you select a number of different revenue and expense codes. And so you'll want to map each one of these items in the raw data to standard codes that the analyzer uses. So for example, here, the gross potential rent is mapped to the gross potential rent here. The loss to lease is loss to lease. Vacancy loss goes to physical vacancy. And then model administrative units and employee units are both mapped to non-revenue units. In this case, when there's multiple lines mapped to a single value, those lines are added up and aggregated to that single code. You'll notice here, for example, other residential income is comprised of many items in the raw data. And so all of those get mapped to the other residential income. So this lets you take, T12s that have a myriad of formats. I've seen so many different formats from different brokers, from different providers, and allows you to map them to a standardized framework. One thing I also find is going through this exercise allows me to understand the T12 at a macro level, understand all of the different line items in there. Sometimes I see CapEx items in the T12, and so this process lets me make sure that I'll avoid those in my analysis, so I just don't map those and things like that. So just going through these exercises gives you some familiarity on the T12. All right, once the mapping is done, we then switch over to the T12 analysis sheet. And you'll notice near the top that there is a button that allows you to pull in the data from the raw data sheet. So I'll go ahead and press that. And it goes in and pulls all of that data into the analysis sheet. And here we have those standardized codes that we looked at earlier, all lined up here, and the aggregation is done across these different codes. Now this particular rent roll raw data starts in July of 2019. So we'll just go ahead and put that as the start date for this T12. So July 2019, and that'll update all of the month names accordingly. Now one thing you'll notice right away is that some of the cells are highlighted in pink. This is done automatically by the analyzer, and it basically looks for data that's an outlier. And the way it does that is it computes the mean for each row, the average value for each row, and also the standard deviation for each row. And if a given number is outside a certain tolerance, certain number of standard deviations from the average, it gets highlighted in pink. Now you can set that parameter as to the number of standard deviations right here. Right now it's set to 2. So let's say I set it to 1.25 standard deviations. That means I want a tighter tolerance. Then you should see more cells highlighted in pink because you're not tightened the tolerance. All right, so we'll just set that back to 2. And you can get a sense that for example, here we have the real estate taxes. You'll notice in December 2019, the real estate taxes are quite high relative to what's been paid in prior months and in subsequent months. So it'll be good to understand, is that a normal pattern? Can something be done to level out those payments? And it's questions you can ask the brokers to understand that better and be better prepared with cash if and when you acquire this property. Okay, so that's one thing to look at right away. In addition, the analyzer also computes the T12 and the T3 annualized totals, and it uses those two numbers to determine if there's a big difference between the two. So for example, if the T3 revenue has jumped up quite a bit, you'll see a large negative number here, and so that'll tell you that the T3 is much higher than the T12, and you can start to dig in as to what's going on. Is it something wherein the seller is just stuffing leases because he knows the property is up for sale, or is this something that's sustainable? So it lets you triangulate to those kind of data points and dig in deeper. And then finally, the analyzer also graphs the revenue versus the expenses, and then the NOI on the right axis, so that you can see macro trends in the performance of the property and quickly drill down into areas where you may want to understand better what's going on with the data. So for example, here where we talked about the taxes being higher than the norm, shows up very clearly in the graph. You can see the NOI drops off and the expenses are higher. So this is a quick way to understand what's going on with the data. Okay, with that, we'll now switch over to the rent roll. Switch our focus over to the rent roll. And just like for the T12, we'll first select the file containing the rent roll. And this is the file we looked at earlier. And within that file, the data is contained in a sheet called Sheet 1. And in this file, in this workbook, we want to copy it into a worksheet called HOH rent roll. I've set the parameter immediately below to no, which means that all of the parameters below here are ignored. Once this parameter is set to yes, these parameters down here come into play. And as I mentioned when we were looking at the rent roll, there are some rent rolls that have multiple lines per unit, and these parameters can be used to control how that data is processed. All right, now that we have set these parameters, we'll go ahead and fetch the data. And you'll note that a new sheet called HOH rent roll has been created, which contains the rent roll data. Now, before I process this data any further, I'm going to create a new column. And this new column will be used to create the unit status in using the terms that are needed by the Multifamily Analyzer. You'll notice that the unit status currently is either occupied or vacant, leased, or applicant, when the analyzer only really needs occupied and vacant. So we're going to map the unit status to occupied or vacant. And for that, we'll use the if statement along with mid, and we'll say equals if mid for the status column, which is over here, comma 1, comma 3 equals occupied. Then we want it to be occupied. Otherwise, we'll be vacant. Don't worry about the details of the formula. That's not critical here. What's important is that we have now created a new column that contains a status of either occupied or vacant. And the reason why I'm doing this is obviously to create a new column that has only those two values, but more importantly, to let you know that if you don't have any specific data in your rent roll, or if you need to convert some data in a way that works, you can do that, and this analyzer will work on that newly created data as well. All right, now that we have created all of this information, we will go ahead and copy all of this data into the raw data sheet. We'll copy, including this newly created column, we'll paste it into the rent roll raw data sheet. Once again, we'll do a paste special and values only. And you'll notice that there are unit mappings, just like for the T12. There are mappings for the rent roll, but they are arranged in a row across the top here. And various units, various data elements, in the rent roll are mapped to standardized data units in the analyzer. And for the rent roll, there are 8 mappings, or 9 mappings that are required. I'm sorry, not 8. And they are listed up here. If you do the drop down, you'll see the list of the 9 mappings, and you usually want to have all 9 of them available. Once again, if you have data missing or you need to augment data, you can do that and then set up the mapping. So for example, sometimes the move-in date is not included in the raw rent roll, and in which case I typically set the move-in date to be the same as the lease start date. As you can see, your lease start date, if the move-in date is missing, you can just create a column and use the lease start date to be the move-in date. That way you have data available, even though it's not accurate data, it's data available, and that can be run through the analysis, knowing full well that it's made up data. You still have the analysis complete, and you can ignore some of the information some of the analysis that relies on the move-in date information. Okay, now that you have all the data, you set up the mappings, unit, type, the square footage, the move-in date, the lease start, the lease end, the market rent, the rent, and then our new column that we created, it's mapped to status. Okay, I've already pre-mapped this, that's why they're already there, but you would go and map them. And then just like for the T12, you don't want any of the values here to be blank in the orange cell up to the last line, up to the last column that you've been reading. So we'll go ahead and put an X here, that way the code scans this column as well. Once you've set up the mapping, we go over to the rent roll analysis tab. We have already cleared the input data, so we can go ahead and pull in the data. We do that, it pulls in the data from the mappings that we've already done, just pulling in the columns that are required. You'll notice that our status that got pulled in either as occupied as vacant, as per the new column that we created. And then we go ahead and press the refresh data tables button, which then goes ahead and refreshes all of these graphs, and then more importantly, the pivot tables that drive those graphs. Now these pivot tables are all arranged to the right over here, and you'll notice that summary information on the units is included in the pivot table. So for example, the different unit types, the average rent for these unit types, the square footage for the unit types, the count for the unit types. So in many underwriting tools, this information is required. So you can just go ahead and copy and paste this information into your underwriting tool for underwriting the deal. So that's one convenient feature that's available in this analyzer. And then up on the top here, there's some summary information that includes things like the number of vacant units, the percentage of vacant units. It calculates the economic vacancy. It attributes the economic vacancy to either vacancy or loss to lease. So some good summary information that you can get a quick snapshot of the property on. And then there's a number of charts that are created automatically. The first chart here lists by unit type the average rent, the average market rent, the max rent in that unit, the average square footage, the rent per square foot, and the market rent per square foot. So you can see in a quick snapshot the different rents for different units. The maximum rent is useful to understand if you are considering increasing rents, whether that rent has already been achieved in a unit. So that's kind of a useful bit of information. You also have a summary of the number of units and the square footage, the breakdown by unit type. You have the lease roll-off schedule, so it kind of shows you when leases are expiring, so that you can think about either marketing aggressively ahead of lease roll-offs, or if you're going to be acquiring the property and you're going to be immediately having some lease roll-offs, thinking about how you can mitigate that issue. It also has tenancy duration analysis, which tells you how long tenants have been in the property. So between 0 and 500 days, there's 180 tenants. 500 and 999 days, there's 91 tenants. So in this case, it really gives you some color as to how sticky tenants are at the property. And then your rent trend chart. Now this rent trend is only relevant by unit type. Now you can select a specific unit type up here. So let's say you want to look at this particular unit type, A4R. You select that, and all of these charts update for that unit type. And more importantly, the rent trend for that unit type is produced in this chart. So basically the way it works is it looks at the lease start date for each unit and plots the rent for that unit. And based on that, you can see whether the rents have been generally going down or up as leases were renewed. And obviously rents going up is a good sign, rents going down maybe not such a good sign. And then finally, you have a scatter plot, essentially a box and whisker plot by unit type that shows the rent distribution by unit type. So it shows you the max, the min, the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile, the median, the mean rents. And so it gives you a sense of how the rents are spread out by unit type. So with that, that is a quick summary of usage of the analytical tool and some of the analysis that's produced. Hopefully you'll find it useful. Please let me know if you have any feedback in the comments below or by sending me an email. Thank you.